The phrase "I am" appears in the Gospels as a breaking point. It doesn't function merely as grammar. It functions as identity signaling. The historical problem begins here. Jesus, a Galilean Jew of the 1st century, spoke predominantly Aramaic in everyday life. Yet the Gospels that reached us were written in Koine Greek. How does a formula so loaded, associated with the divine name, cross this linguistic path and continue producing the same effect? Conflict, accusation, and, in certain accounts, attempted execution. To investigate this with method, we need to separate 3 layers. First, the layer of the Hebrew biblical text, where language about God's name takes shape. Second, the layer of the Greek translation of the Scriptures, the Septuagint, which molds the religious vocabulary of Hellenized Jews and also many readers of early Christianity. Third, the layer of the Gospel of John, which organizes Jesus' material into extensive discourses with a style that stands out clearly from Mark, Matthew, and Luke. The inevitable starting point is Exodus 3. In Exodus 3:1-12, Moses encounters the burning bush and receives a call. In Exodus 3:13, Moses asks for the name of the one sending him. The answer in Exodus 3:14 is recorded as Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. The Hebrew construction can be translated as I am who I am, or I will be who I will be. The text then links this statement to the name YHWH in Exodus 3:15. Here, the name doesn't appear as a simple label. It appears as a way of affirming presence and historical faithfulness. The God who acts, who is with his people, who defines himself through continuity. Over the centuries, this name becomes surrounded by practices of reverence. In the Second Temple period, pronunciation of the Tetragrammaton becomes restricted. In public readings, it's replaced by Adonai, and in common speech, by other circumlocutions. This caution isn't a devotional detail, it has social and legal consequences. Texts like Leviticus 24:16 foresee severe sanctions for blasphemy. In the 1st century, in an environment of political pressure and religious surveillance, any claim perceived as improper appropriation of the divine name becomes explosive. It's in this scenario that the Gospel of John presents a series of Jesus declarations using the formula ego eimi, I am. In several passages, it comes with a predicate, I am the bread of life, John 6:35, I am the light of the world, John 8:12, I am the good shepherd, John 10:11. These phrases can be read as metaphors of function, guidance, and leadership. However, the Gospel also records occurrences where ego eimi appears absolutely without complement. And it's at this point that the investigation becomes more delicate. The most cited example is John 8:58. Before Abraham was, I am. The text doesn't present this as harmless figure of speech. The public's reaction in John 8:59 is the attempt at stoning. Regardless of how one evaluates the exact historicity of the dialogue, the author presupposes that his readers would understand why the phrase ignited immediate conflict. The question then isn't just, what did Jesus say? But what does the Gospel claim that speech meant within the Jewish universe of the period? To advance, we need to investigate how the language of I am functions in Jewish scriptures, especially when they pass from Hebrew to Greek. And we need to do this without drawing premature conclusions. The focus here is reconstructing the path of words, concepts, and reactions. The linguistic bridge between Aramaic, Hebrew, and Greek is the point that usually generates confusion. Jesus spoke Aramaic, but that doesn't prevent an idea or a formula from being preserved in Greek with equivalent value. The Gospels, after all, aren't stenographic transcriptions. They're theological and historical narratives written for specific communities. What matters, therefore, isn't whether Jesus literally pronounced the Greek syllables ego eimi, but whether John's author believed he was translating, for his audience, a self-affirmation of identity that was already loaded with meaning in the Jewish world. Here, the Septuagint plays a central role. It's not just a translation. It's a linguistic repertoire. In Exodus 3:14, the Septuagint translates the statement as ego eimi ho on, something like, I am the one who is, or I am being. This choice brings biblical revelation closer to Greek categories about being and existence, but maintains the core. God presents himself as the one whose existence doesn't depend on anything external. However, Exodus isn't the only relevant source. There's a body of prophetic texts, especially in Isaiah, in which God uses formulas of absolute self-identification. In Isaiah 43:10, God affirms that before him there was no God, and after him there will be none. In Isaiah 46:4, God declares continuity from the people's youth to old age. In Isaiah 48:12, the formula I am He appears, linked to the idea of primacy and permanence. In the Septuagint, these passages frequently use ego eimi as a short and emphatic form. For Hellenized Jewish readers, ego eimi wasn't just I exist. It was a textual marker that referred to divine discourses in Isaiah and, ultimately, to the horizon of Exodus. This point is reinforced by first-century Jewish authors. Philo of Alexandria comments on Exodus 3:14 and associates the expression with attributes of God's immutability and permanence. What matters here isn't agreeing with Philo's philosophy, but recognizing that, in Hellenistic Judaism, the relationship between I am and divine identity was already an available reading. Now, let's return to the Gospel of John. Chapter 8 organizes a debate about sonship, authority, and legitimacy. Jesus' interlocutors appeal to Abraham as foundation. The narrative then places Jesus affirming anteriority to Abraham in John 8:58. Within Jewish monotheism, anteriority to Abraham, united with a formula of absolute self-identification, isn't a trivial claim. Even if someone tried to read it as I am, in the sense of I am the chosen one, the text itself leads the reader to greater tension, because the verb tense and the contrast with Abraham don't operate in the common register. The reaction described in John 8:59, the attempted stoning, functions as a narrative indicator that the hearers interpreted that as blasphemy or improper appropriation of divine language. This dialogues with the legal background. Leviticus 24:16 is on the horizon, and later legal traditions preserved in the Mishnah carefully discuss what constitutes blasphemy and how it relates to use of the sacred name. Even recognizing that the Mishnah is compiled later, it reflects debates that have earlier roots. There's still a social factor. Second Temple Judaism wasn't monolithic. There were Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and other currents. The Dead Sea Scrolls, associated with the Qumran environment, show a community highly attentive to purity, language, and distinction between the sacred and profane. This type of culture reinforces why certain formulas could generate shock. Sensitivity to the name, to prophetic status, to messianic status, and to discourse legitimacy was real. Up to here we've analyzed how the Septuagint shaped understanding of I am, and how Hellenistic Judaism already recognized this formula as divine language. Leave your opinion in the comments. Do you believe John was translating a real identity or constructing a later theological interpretation? Your perspective enriches this debate. The question that arises now is fundamental. Are we facing a literal affirmation within the biblical narrative or a symbolic construction understood in a specific way by the original audience? From here, the focus will be evaluating two readings that compete in research: the agency interpretation, where a representative speaks with the authority of the one who sends him, and the ontological identity interpretation, where the text attributes to Jesus direct participation in divine being. And to keep the investigation honest, we also need to look at the contrast with the Synoptic Gospels. When comparing John with Mark, Matthew, and Luke, it becomes evident that the fourth Gospel uses a more elaborate and theologically structured discourse style. This doesn't prove, by itself, that John invented speeches, but it indicates that the author organizes Jesus' memory and community interpretation distinctly. The historical question becomes, what is the relationship between the words attributed to Jesus and the way they were transmitted and interpreted? Here enters the category of agency, widely discussed in ancient Judaism studies. In many biblical narratives, a messenger can speak in first person, as if he were the sender himself. There are scenes where the angel of the Lord speaks with divine authority, and, in the text's flow, the boundary between messenger and God seems deliberately porous. This doesn't mean the messenger is God in essence, but that he carries God's authority. In Second Temple Judaism, this logic of representation could be even more sophisticated. The idea of sent one, an authorized agent, allows explaining why certain individuals speak and act with authority without the community abandoning monotheism. Some researchers apply this lens to certain Jesus declarations. In this reading, when John uses ego eimi, he could be emphasizing the singular authority of God's sent one, without requiring complete ontological identity. But John's text itself frequently surpasses common agency. John 1:1-3 describes the Logos in relationship with God in the beginning, and attributes participation in creation. John 10:30 records, "I and the Father are one," a phrase that, in the plot, also provokes accusation-reaction. The narrative insists, repeatedly, on a proximity that isn't merely functional. This leads many interpreters to read absolute ego eimi as part of a larger pattern, the gospel presenting Jesus with attributes that, in Judaism, belong to God. At this point, it's essential not to oversimplify the narrated reactions as if they were merely religious. They also have a political and social component. A discourse that seems to challenge sacred boundaries can be seen as a threat of disorder. In a Judea under Roman rule, any movement that seems to generate public commotion and internal conflict can attract repression. The Gospel of John, in fact, records explicit concerns about repercussion and social control at different moments, though each episode needs critical evaluation. The accusation of blasphemy must also be understood carefully. Blasphemy, in the Jewish context, isn't synonymous with generic insult. It's often language or action that usurps divine prerogatives. In Leviticus 24:16, the concern is with the name. In later debates preserved in rabbinic tradition, the question includes how and when the name is pronounced and what type of formulation constitutes profanation. This brings us back to John 8:58-59. The combination of pre-existence before Abraham and a formula of absolute self-identification is what makes the statement explosive. Even if someone tried to reduce "I am" to a mission statement, the temporal contrast and the echo of scriptures make the reading more complex. It's here that many readers ask, if this was so central, why don't Mark, Matthew, and Luke record the same type of speech? The most prudent historical answer is recognizing that each evangelist operates with his own literary and theological objectives. Mark tends to be concise and narrative. Matthew and Luke work with traditions and discourses, but maintain a different style from John's long dialogue. John, in turn, constructs scenes where debates function as identity exposition. This difference can reflect both theological development over decades and distinct selection and organization of material. The result isn't an automatic conclusion. It's a framework. John transmits "I am" as an interpretive key. The Jewish context provides semantic weight, and the narrated reaction functions as an indicator that the original reader should perceive the phrase's gravity. To close the historical circle, we need to observe how the first Christian communities interpreted Jesus' identity even before John was written, and how this connects to the theme of the name. Paul's letters predate the Gospel of John and already demonstrate elevated Christology in certain passages. Philippians 2:6-11 describes Jesus existing in the form of God, followed by humiliation and exaltation. culminating with attribution of the name above every name. The text doesn't need to specify what that name is for the Jewish reader, and the reader familiar with scriptures to suspect what's being suggested. Another frequently cited passage is 1 Corinthians 8:6, which reformulates a monotheistic confession by speaking of one God, the Father, and one Lord, Jesus Christ. From a historical point of view, this shows that debates about how to speak of Jesus without breaking monotheism were already underway very early. It's important, however, not to confuse elevated language with complete philosophical definition. First-century theology isn't yet later conciliar theology. Communities are experimenting with language, reinterpreting texts, and constructing formulas that make sense within Israel's biblical universe. In this process, the Septuagint provides vocabulary and connections. The ego eimi of Isaiah and Exodus becomes a possible resource to explain Jesus' uniqueness. Now, on the non-Christian Jewish side, sources are more reticent to enter this type of detail. Josephus mentions Jesus briefly and in disputed and debated passages, but doesn't develop a theological analysis of the name. This silence isn't proof of the debate's non-existence, but shows that, outside Christian communities, there was no interest in recording the internal nuances of a controversy that could be considered marginal or simply dangerous. The Dead Sea Scrolls, in turn, don't speak of Jesus, but are valuable for context. They evidence how certain Jewish groups interpreted scriptures with intensity, how they applied titles and eschatological expectations, and how they maintained rigorous boundaries between the sacred and profane. This helps explain why language that touched the name could be perceived as transgression. It's also worth remembering that Judaism of the period had diverse messianic expectations. Some were more political, others more priestly, others more eschatological. When an individual appears in public space, gathering followers and speaking with authority, interpretations multiply. The language of "I am," as John presents it, enters this scenario as an intensification. Not just messenger, not just prophet, but someone whose identity approaches formulas that, in scriptures, belong to God. Here the investigation finds a balance point. It's possible to recognize that John presents a theologically developed portrait without needing to automatically affirm that everything is literary fiction. The Gospel is, apparently, interpreting events and words in light of decades of community reflection, using textual tools that Judaism already provided: Exodus, Isaiah, the weight of the name, and legal and social sensitivity to blasphemy. The question then isn't resolved simply with Jesus spoke Aramaic, so John doesn't count. Historically, what occurs is translation of meaning, not of sound. John writes in Greek for readers who use scriptures in Greek and who would recognize echoes of ego eimi. This explains why the text presumes immediate reaction and why controversy is presented as inevitable. In the final stage, it's appropriate to gather the unavoidable elements without closing the case with artificial certainty. First, the divine name, linked to the Tetragrammaton, was surrounded by reverence and restrictions in Second Temple Judaism, and this has biblical basis in discussions about blasphemy, like Leviticus 24:16. Second, the Septuagint provided vocabulary where ego eimi appears in contexts of divine self-identification, especially in Exodus 3:14 and in emphatic formulas in Isaiah, like Isaiah 43:10 and Isaiah 48:12. Third, the Gospel of John uses ego eimi, both with predicate and, in some moments, absolutely, and associates this with narrative conflicts, as in John 8:58-59. Fourth, the linguistic distance between Jesus' Aramaic and the Gospel's Greek doesn't eliminate semantic weight. It shifts the problem from the level of phonetics to the level of interpretation. John seems interested in telling the reader what those speeches meant within a specific biblical map. And that map was recognizable because Judaism had already constructed, over centuries, the weight of the name. Fifth, academic research divides into emphases. There are readings that privilege divine agency, explaining how a sent one can speak with authority without this configuring total ontological identity. There are readings that see in John a step beyond, suggesting more direct participation in divine being. And there's still debate about how much John preserves historical memory and how much he reorganizes traditions for theological purposes. In upcoming episodes, we'll advance in this investigation and analyze how this theme was understood by the first Christians and how its implications cross the centuries. If you want to follow this documentary series continuously, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. We close where we began, with a question that remains uncomfortably open. When the Gospel of John places on Jesus' lips the formula, "I am," is it recording a specific speech in its final form, or is it translating and intensifying, for its audience, the meaning of an identity that was already being discussed and interpreted? If the shock reaction in the text suggests that something was understood as appropriation of the sacred, does this indicate a real claim in Jesus' ministry? Or does it reveal primarily how Christian communities came to read Jesus' life in light of Exodus and Isaiah? Historically, "I am" remains as a point where language, translation, and memory intersect. And it's exactly in this intersection, between what may have been said, what was remembered, and what was written, that investigation continues.